So disclaimer, when I was offered this spot, I was told it was a speed talk, and I seem to have missed the memo that it was a full talk, so I'll talk very slowly. I'm Becca. I'm here to talk about part of my PhD research, which was using games to explore human-lion coexistence. So why use games in comparison to kind of more typical survey techniques such as questionnaires? Well, the idea is that with games, we can begin to understand behaviour a little bit better. So they can be used as tools to understand how people make decisions, and also to look at the impact of different incentives on behaviour, and to test the acceptability of different kind of conflict mitigation measures with stakeholders. So obviously they represent a very simplified version of reality, but they can potentially act as a lens into real-world behaviour and real-world decision-making. So we trialled the use of a game to measure human-lion interactions. Apologies if you can't see very well at the back, it would have been better on the big screen, but it was played on a tablet with 4 players. Basically, the dark green is the active player, and you can maybe just about see the little brown icons are lions, which move around the kind of landscape in the grazing area, and if they land on one of your squares, they will cause some damage, so they'll kill some of your cows. And basically the players could choose from 4 different options of what they were going to do on their grazing squares. They could choose to graze their cattle, and there would be a score of 8 grazing points for them unless a lion happened to land on it and kill some cows. They could choose to graze on the square and try to scare off any lions using a non-lethal scaring technique. This had a small cost, so -2 points, so this is equivalent to the cost of potentially buying some lion lights or buying a horn to try and scare off the lions. And if you successfully scared a lion, it moved off to a different area of the board. You could also choose to try and spear any lions that come near your cows, and this had a slightly higher cost because obviously it's a bit risky trying to spear a lion, it's a bit dangerous, and it's an illegal behaviour, so if you were caught, there's potential you'd get into trouble. But if you successfully speared a lion, that little lion icon was removed from the game, so there were fewer lions in the next rounds. And then the final thing they could do was to not graze any cattle and leave an area free as wildlife habitat. So this, in the baseline treatment, there were no points for leaving wildlife habitat, but the potential benefit of this was that it was more attractive habitat for the lions, and that lions would potentially move away from your cattle into this natural habitat to hunt wild prey instead. So everyone played this baseline game, and then they also played 3 other treatments to test the kind of impact of different incentives. So one treatment was support for deterrence, where the cost of this non-lethal scaring option was reduced to 0. So basically a conservation charity was coming and giving you some free kind of vuvuzelas or something to scare the lion. There was a habitat, and then there were 2 habitat subsidy treatments. So in those treatments, you actually got some kind of bonus points for providing wildlife habitat, and this was either provided at an individual level, so you placed a habitat square on your grazing area, and then you got the points for yourself. And it was also provided at a communal level, so it was based on the total number of habitat squares that all 4 of the players put, and then the points were shared between them. So the idea was we could try and use this game to look at things like which of these different incentives best promoted pro-conservation behaviour, so tried to discourage people from trying to spear the lions. Following the game, we also did a questionnaire with each player and collected some background data on some of their socio-economic kind of factors, and also a few questions on attitudes towards wildlife and kind of perceptions of these different options, to see if socioeconomic factors or attitudinal factors linked to what they were doing in the game. So we played these games in Ruaha, Tanzania. I won't talk too much about the study area because Amy's already introduced you to it, and Benji in other sessions as well. We played 43 games across villages in Ruaha. As you can see, we played predominantly with men, and we didn't have a huge sample size of women, but that's because we were asking to speak to people that were responsible for making the livestock management decisions, which in these communities is mainly the men. Interestingly, over 3/4 of the players had not actually lost any cows to livestock within the past year. And so just to rattle through some of the things that we found, so this shows the average proportion of decisions across the different treatments and the rounds. So you can see that kill decisions, which is the dark red bars, made up a very small percentage of decisions across all the treatments and all the rounds, so that was nice. In the baseline treatment, people predominantly just grazed across around 60% of their board, and then the remaining decisions were mainly using the non-lethal scaring option, so that's the orange colour. You can see in the support for deterrence treatment that this dramatically increased the number of scaring choices that were being made, so the pale orange in the top right. And then for the individual habitat subsidies, again, offering points to the individuals for providing wildlife habitat dramatically increased the amount of habitat that was provided in the game, and this continued to increase throughout rounds of that treatment. But for the communal level habitat subsidy, although it did increase the amount of habitat provided, it was to a much lower extent than when they got the individual points for themselves, and the effect decreased across rounds of the game, presumably as they were reacting to their team members not actually providing habitat with them. We also found that decisions of players in the previous round affected decisions in the current round, so the total number of squares of habitat that other players provided, if they all provided a lot, you were more likely to provide habitat in your next round. So basically they were copying each other. They were taking cues from each other. In terms of the socioeconomic factors, what we found was that actually most of the player characteristics did not correlate with the game behaviour, which was interesting. So there were some evidence of weak correlations between gender and number of livestock owned and decisions to provide habitat. However, as you saw, our sample size of women was very small, so this would be something that would be interesting to look into a bit further, because we also found that groups of men made less scared decisions than mixed gender groups. So there seems to be some gender artifacts in there, but would require a more diverse sample of people. So I don't know, I feel like I've been really fast there, but anyway, to conclude, the non-lethal scaring option seems to be the preferred option for most of the players in the game. However, individual incentives did increase their provision of habitat when they were provided to individuals rather than to community. So that's something that might be relevant for when you're thinking about providing benefits in the real world. Often a lot of times these are given at a communal scale, so kind of benefits given to schools and things, whereas potentially trying to focus a bit more on individual benefits could have more impact. Echoing what Ewan has said and other people have said, it also really highlighted the need to shift away from just focusing on attitudes to actually try and study behaviours and social norms. So as I said, they were copying each other, rather than just kind of assuming that attitudes are going to influence behaviour, which is obviously not the case. And hopefully we demonstrated that games can offer kind of a unique and low-cost way of trialling different potential mitigation methods, and offer quite a unique and engaging approach to discuss these issues that could potentially be quite sensitive in a kind of fun and friendly environment. So I'd just like to say thank you to all my co-authors and funders, and particularly my research assistants and all the communities that took part in somewhat strange data collection technique, I'm sure they thought. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. We already have questions, please.
Sorry, so what about the negative control? What about if killing the lions didn't cost that much? Did you try that?
We didn't try all that. Obviously with the killing, it was interesting to know whether that was something they were just telling us what we wanted to hear. Which is obviously the case not necessarily just for games, but for any questionnaire that you do when you're talking about illegal behaviour. That's a good point. It would have been interesting to reduce the cost of killing, but we did find that result tracked across all of our data collection methods. So also in the questionnaire, when we asked people, do you think that lethal control is a good option for conflict mitigation, 90-something% said no. We also did some kind of informal discussions after the game to talk about what they thought of the game, and it still also tracked that they were all kind of saying we don't think that killing is a good choice. Hopefully that's because the work of the Ruaha Carnivore Project has changed all of their attitudes for the better. But obviously, yeah, with these kinds of things, there's going to be a bit of bias in terms of, especially when there's an external researcher there, in terms of what they will admit to. But this game was actually also used in Gabon on a human-elephant conflict project. And they found that people did choose to kill elephants a lot in the game, and they had a similar setup with points and things. So people do seem to be willing to kill the animals in the games. So I'm hoping that it's positive, and Ruaha has a good example of attitude change and behaviour change.
Thank you. I really love the approach of the gamification and so forth. But similar to the last question, actually, I'm just really interested if you could tell us more about how you set the cost and benefits functions, because that seems like it would be a problem.
Yeah. So they were somewhat, I don't want to say arbitrary, because that doesn't sound very good, but similar to as Amy was talking yesterday about, you know, the points that they give to the camera trap pictures in terms of how many points you get for different animals. It was kind of based on what would work with the game setup in trying not to have one strategy that was going to super outcompete all the others. And there was some complicated modelling behind how the game worked, which I don't really know too much about because I didn't do that part. And as I said, it was based on an existing game. So I pretty much, this was actually only one chapter of my PhD, and I could have done like a whole PhD on this subject, basically. So yeah, it was kind of just using an existing game and using similar point scores, but obviously trying to actually come up with some realistic thresholds in terms of how much damage losing a cow would actually cost versus compensation and things would be like the next step, yeah.
Wonderful. We have one more question.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm wondering about how much training or practice you might have had to do with the participants playing with a tablet and practicing with the game before you started your data collection?
Good question, yeah. So we did each session, there was a practice game at the beginning, which was just 3 rounds long to get them used to the setup. And actually, they were pretty good. I mean, most of them do have smartphones, so you know they know how to use tablets. I mean, some of the the really old Mosaic struggled a little bit more, but in general, yeah, they picked it up fairly quickly. But yeah, we made sure that through the practice game they had a lot of help from our 2 research assistants to show them how to use it. But it was a long. So in total, with the practice game and the games, and then doing the questionnaires, took between 2 to 3 hours, so it was quite a time-consuming process, yeah, to make sure they understood. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.